Hey guys, so far our React websites have looked pretty ugly, and it's because we haven't been able to add any CSS styling. We've been using these standard HTML elements that we're rendering using React. So in this lesson, I want to talk about how to style your React elements and how you can use attributes in JSX. Go ahead and get hold of your own copy of this current code sandbox and then go ahead and fork it. So if you remember from our lessons on CSS, let's say that we wanted to change this H1's color to red, then we might go into our styles.css and create a class style. So let's just call it heading. And then we change the color to red. So pretty simple style. Now, if we head back into our index.js, if this was actually an HTML file, then adding that class to this h1 would be as easy as adding a class attribute and setting it to heading. Now, in this case, it still works. And when we apply this heading class style from over here into our h1, you can see that it does in fact change the color to red. But let's see what problems we get. If I pop this out in a new window and we go ahead and hit Command Option I to bring up our Chrome Developer Tools, and in the console here, you'll see that you get a warning saying invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So remember that this, even though it looks like HTML, is still being rendered down to JavaScript. And in JavaScript, the property to access all of the classes that exist on an element is a property called class name. Now, React has done some handling behind the scenes so that even if you did leave this as class, it would still work. But there are some hairy situations that you might get yourself into, and the proper name of this attribute is class name. And you'll see that as soon as I change this to class name and we go back and reload this site now, that warning goes away. While we're here, if you're curious what this warning is about and why it's telling us that in our index.js file on line 1, it doesn't recognize this angle bracket, well, the reason is because it doesn't know that this index.js file is in fact a JSX file that includes HTML elements rather than just a bog standard normal JavaScript file. So how can we tell it that this is a JSX file? Well, if we go into our index.html and the place where we're importing our script here, normally when we add a JavaScript script, we provide the source and we provide the type as a text file with JavaScript code. But in our case, this is still a text file, but it's now JSX code. So we got to change this to JSX. And if we hit save, we go back and reload our website, you'll notice that warning is now gone because it knows that this is a JSX file that can include HTML-like code. The other thing that some of you guys might have noticed is that when we add an attribute in normal HTML, it's not camel cased like this, where the first word is lowercase and the next words are capitalized, like the N for name here. Instead, it looks like this. So here I've got a list of all the HTML global attributes. So these attributes can be used on any HTML element. And one of these is called content editable. And notice how it's not camel cased. It's all one word. But when we head back to our JSX file, the convention that you should follow is to name it like as if it's JavaScript. So if it's called content editable, then we're going to call it content editable. And you can see that already the auto suggest from the JSX code completion is telling me to write it camel case like so. And let's set it to true. Now if I hit save and go ahead and click on my H1, you can see that it's now a editable element. And if we set it to false, then this is not editable like a normal H1 should be. So if I change this back to the HTML attribute style, where everything is not camel case, and I hit save, you'll notice that it no longer works the same. Again, I lose my JavaScript powers. So remember that whenever you're writing attributes in HTML to make them camel cased, anything that you know of from HTML attributes, you have to change it to the camel case version. So if I go ahead and make my H1 editable again by setting this to true, and I start typing some mumbo jumbo, you can see that normally if you're within Chrome, you get your spell check activated. Go ahead and pause the video and take a look at this list of global attributes to see if there's a way for you to turn off the spell check so that we no longer get these red underlines happening here. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so as you can see, we have an attribute called spell check, and we can specify whether if the element is to have its spelling checked. Let's go ahead and convert this attribute, all lowercase, into camel case and add it as an attribute in our JSX file. So already we've got spell check being suggested to us, and I'm going to set it to false. So now when I start editing my H1 and writing some complete gibberish, it's not trying to check my spelling anymore. So the most common attribute that you're going to be adding is going to be the class name, because this is the preferred way to add styling to your React elements. And as you'll see in the next lesson, while there are other ways that we can style these elements, including inline styling, the documentation still recommends to apply all your styling through classes that you specify within a CSS file and then applying it to your JSX file using this class name attribute. Now remember that just because we're using React to create these HTML elements and we're learning about how to use these attributes in JSX, the rest of what you've learned about CSS or HTML doesn't just become invalid, right? So for example, I've got a UL here with a bunch of list items, and I can, just as I would in normal CSS, target the UL elements on my page just by writing the word UL, and then I go ahead and change the color to blue. And now when I go back and refresh my page, my UL or my unordered list should turn blue. So in this case, I'm not adding any attributes. I'm simply saying that on the page, if there are any unordered list items, make sure that everything inside all of its children gets turned blue. So you can target classes using CSS, you can target IDs, and you can target HTML elements directly as well. Although in reality, it'd be very rare for you to just broad stroke tell all of the UI elements from now until forever to have a particular style like what we've done here. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete this unordered list, and I'm going to replace it with a div. Now inside this div, I'm going to add 3 image elements, and these are images that I found in Google to replace each of those things that I've listed in my unordered list. Now, here's a challenge for you. I want you to do the same thing, namely create 3 image elements, like what I've done here, and to find images via Google image search, and then to copy the image address and paste it in as the source of the image. But here's the catch. I want you to use CSS to change each of these images to have the same size, to be squares 100 pixels by 100 pixels. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so we know that in order to change each of these images to 100 by 100, we have to change something in our CSS. Now, what I want to do is I want to create a class which I'll call food-image. And remember that in CSS, the convention for all of these essentially variable names that you're creating is what's called kebab case. So they're all lowercase and they're separated by a dash. Now for all of the elements which get the food image class, I'm going to change its height to 100 pixels and its width to 100 pixels as well. Now all I have to do is to apply that class to all three of these image elements. And a neat trick inside Code Sandbox is you can hold down the Option or Alt key on your keyboard and take your cursor to all the places where you want to type simultaneously. So you can see it's now flashing on 3 lines. And here I'm going to add a new attribute called class name, and I'm going to set that to equal to that class name that I created just now, which is called food-img. And now when we hit save and we refresh our website, you can see that they are now all rendered as 100 by 100 pixel images because my CSS is being applied. Now you can also insert JavaScript as an attribute. So for example, let's use a service called Lorem Pixum, where they generate stylish random images just by tapping into a particular URL and specifying the size. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL for the image, and then I'm going to create it as a constant. I'm going to call it img. And then inside here, I'm going to paste a string that holds the URL for a random photo from Pixum. And now inside my div, I'm going to create an image element, and I'm going to add the source to be equal to this particular image constant. So as soon as I do that, you can see that it shows up over here. And if I hit save, in fact, you'll see that this closing tag for the image element should disappear. And it turns into a self-closing tag because there are no children or there's nothing in between the opening and closing tags. Now, remember that normally, if you wrote code like this in HTML, where it just has the opening part and no closing part, HTML will forgive you for this. You can see that if I go ahead and cut this out of my JSX file and paste it into my actual HTML inside this div, you can see that it will work if I have this backslash, which denotes a self-closing HTML element, or if I don't, which is actually just the opening tag. HTML is really very forgiving, but JSX is not so forgiving. If you don't have this closing tag, then this is not valid JSX, and you will get an error telling you unterminated JSX contents, and we have to add a termination to say that this is the end of this element. In this lesson, we've seen how we can use JavaScript properties as attributes in our JSX. So all of the attributes that you're already familiar with from HTML, such as source or href or all of those things, you can use in your JSX. But for all of the attributes that have more than one word, then you have to turn it into a camel-cased version of it in order for it to work. We also saw that you can use JavaScript expressions as the values for the attributes, as long as you include them inside a set of curly braces. So for example, Pixum allows you to turn all the images into grayscale by appending this query, $grayscale, to the end of the URL. So in our case, we can simply change our JavaScript expression to be the image URL plus the $grayscale. And now when you refresh, it should show you all the images but converted to grayscale. And we're able to do this because we're able to use JavaScript as the value of our attributes. Now, if you're wondering why we're getting so many warnings Well, it's because Code Sandbox comes pre-built with a linter from ESLint. So it will pick up on the things that you're not doing quite right. So for example, in terms of our image elements, we should always have a alt text that describes to people who aren't able to see, who are looking at these websites through screen readers, etc., what these images are actually of. So if we add some alt text in all of these places, we'll write alt equals something space, and we can say that this one is random, this one is bacon, and this one is hamon, and this one is going to be noodles. So now we get rid of all our warnings from the linter, and we provide people with screen readers who can't see a better description of what's actually on the screen. So I'm going to include the code in this completed lesson as a link in the course resources. So if there's anything that you want to mess around with, and especially revisit some of those topics that we discussed in this lesson and trying it out for yourself if you haven't already. If this is at all confusing, I really recommend to just delete the whole thing and then try to recreate the end website yourself and see if you can achieve the same results using the things that you've learned in this lesson. And you can always refer to this completed code whenever you need to. Just take a moment, take a breath, and try to get used to this idea of using these attributes and using it to style your React elements. Once you're done and comfortable, then head over to the next lesson where we're going to talk more about inline styling in JSX.